I was stacking firewood on the front porch when I heard gravel crunching in the driveway. That particular sound a vehicle makes when it's too heavy for the road, laboring over the loose stones. I straightened up and shielded my eyes against the late afternoon sun, and my first thought, before I even registered what I was seeing, was, "That's a moving truck." My second thought was, "I know that car following behind it." 4 years. 4 years since my son's number had appeared on my phone, since I'd heard his voice or stood in the same room as his wife. 4 years of birthdays that passed without a text message, of holidays I spent eating soup alone at the kitchen counter while scrolling through photos on social media of gatherings I hadn't been invited to. 4 years of gradually stopping myself from asking what I'd done wrong and arriving, slowly and painfully, at the conclusion that the question itself was wrong, that I hadn't done anything, that my daughter-in-law had decided I was unnecessary, and my son had let her make that decision for both of them. I set down the piece of birch I was holding. My hands were steadier than I expected. They parked, and my son got out first. He'd aged. There were lines around his eyes that were new to me, a heaviness in his jaw that looked less like maturity, and more like someone who had been bracing for something unpleasant for a very long time. His wife came around from the passenger side with that expression I remembered well. Bright and busy, already scanning the property, already measuring. "Mom," he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and didn't come closer. "You look good." "Scott." I let his name sit there for a moment. Then I looked at the truck idling behind them, the 2 hired men visible through the windshield. "What is this?" His wife smiled. She had always had a gift for smiling in a way that made you feel you'd ask something naive. "We've been worried about you," she said. "Out here alone since Celia passed. We thought it made more sense for us all to be together." "You're moving in," I said. It wasn't a question. "We thought it would be good for everyone." She spread her hands open like she was presenting something obvious, something generous even. "You've got all this space. We gave up our lease last month. Fresh start." I looked at my son. He was studying the railing on my porch. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't shock, exactly, and it wasn't the old helplessness I used to feel around my daughter-in-law. The way her confidence could make me feel like my own instincts were wrong. What I felt was something colder and more clear. I understood immediately that confronting her on the front porch with a moving truck in the driveway would give her exactly what she had always wanted from me. The image of a difficult, reactive, unreasonable woman. I had been that character in her version of events for years. I wasn't going to play it again. I needed to understand what they actually wanted before I moved. I needed to watch. "Come inside," I said. "I'll put on coffee." Celia had left me the cabin when she died of pancreatic cancer 3 months earlier. It sat on a small lake in Vermont, surrounded by white pines, with a garden she'd tended for 20 years along the south side of the house. She'd built a life here, quiet and specific and full of things she loved. Seed catalogs on every flat surface, bird feeders outside every window, a porch swing that needed a new chain she'd never gotten around to replacing. I had come up the week after the funeral to begin going through her things, and I'd realized almost immediately that I was going to stay. My daughter-in-law moved through the cabin the way an assessor moves through a property before auction. She touched things. She opened doors and stood in the frames calculating. She paused at the kitchen window and looked at the lake and said, "Property values on this kind of water must be remarkable." "I really wouldn't know," I said. "I have no plans to sell." She gave me the patient look, the one that communicated I was being gently corrected. "Of course not, but it's always worth knowing what your assets are worth, especially at your age, living alone." Scott sat at the kitchen table and barely spoke. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the surface of his coffee. I recognized that too, the specific stillness of a man who knows he's somewhere wrong and has run out of ways to tell himself otherwise. By afternoon, the movers had stacked boxes in the back hallway. I let it happen. I made a second pot of coffee, and I watched my daughter-in-law reorganize my dish rack while she told me she'd been reading about lakeside property maintenance, and that salt air was actually worse than lake air for most materials, so I was lucky. I hadn't corrected her, hadn't laughed, just listened and noted everything. When she mentioned the property value again that evening, casually, in the context of estate planning, and how important it was for women my age to have someone helping manage these things, I went to bed knowing exactly what kind of visit this was. That night, I sat at the small desk in Celia's study. This was where I felt closest to her books on the shelves, her reading glasses folded on a seed catalog, her handwriting in the margins of a novel I'd given her for Christmas years ago. I hadn't moved anything in here yet. I wasn't ready. I was looking for a tax document I'd seen earlier when I opened the bottom desk drawer. Underneath, a folder of receipts, was a shoebox. The lid was loose, and when I lifted it, I sat very still for a long time before I touched anything. Letters. At least 30 envelopes, maybe more. Each one addressed in Celia's careful handwriting. My name, my old address, then my current one. All of them stamped. All of them marked return to sender in the same neat notation on the front. I recognized the handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards, on grocery lists left on my refrigerator, on sticky notes pressed to my son's lunch bags before he was old enough to make his own. I had not seen it in 4 years. My daughter-in-law had been returning my sister's letters. I sat at Celia's desk for a long time without moving. I thought about the years I had believed my sister was pulling away from me. When she stopped responding, when I assumed she was busy, when I told myself that illness changes people, that maybe she needed space, I didn't know how to give. I had grieved for an additional loss I hadn't named out loud. And all that time, Celia had been writing. Monthly, sometimes more, writing to me and watching every letter come back. She had died thinking I never wrote back. I put the lid on the box. I put the box in my large purse, under my cardigan. I walked out to the kitchen, said goodnight to my son and his wife in a completely normal voice, and went to bed. I left before they were awake the next morning. I drove 40 minutes to a town I'd never visited and walked into a law office with a plain sign on the door. Marta Ellison, attorney at law. She had short silver hair, a desk buried under folders, and the habit of looking directly at you when you spoke. She poured coffee without asking if I wanted any. I told her everything: the moving truck, the 4 years of silence, the immediate conversations about property value, the suggestion, already twice in less than 24 hours, that I needed help managing things at my age. And then the box of letters. She set down her pen when I got to the letters. 4 years of letters, she repeated. I haven't counted them all yet. And she was intercepting them. Her handwriting on every return label. Marta was quiet for a moment in the way that experienced people are quiet. Not processing, just allowing the weight of something to settle. Here's what I need you to do today, she said finally. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to any changes to the deed or any financial arrangement without calling me first, and go to your bank this afternoon. At the bank, the manager's name was Ingrid. Practical, unhurried, the kind of competence that doesn't announce itself. I gave her enough of the situation that she understood the shape of it. Flag the account, she said before I'd finished asking, and let's add a secondary verification layer on any transfer over $200. We went through everything: passwords, security questions, contact procedures if anyone came in claiming to act on my behalf. She noted the conversation in my file. When I thanked her, she gave me a brief, direct look. This happens more than people realize, she said, especially with family. I was back at the cabin by noon. My daughter-in-law had moved my reading chair away from the window while I was gone. Not dramatically, just enough that the view was wrong. I moved it back without explaining myself. That afternoon, My son found me on the back porch. He sat down without being invited, which was more like the son I'd known than anything he'd done since arriving. He had the look of a man who had been awake half the night. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about the property." "I know you do." He blinked. "You know?" "Scott." I looked at him calmly. "You brought a moving truck. You gave up your lease. Within 2 hours of arriving, your wife had mentioned property values twice and asked about my estate planning. I'm 62, not confused." I paused. "How much do you owe?" The number he told me was large enough to explain everything. A private lender 18 months ago, a bad investment that had gone sideways, payments that had compounded in ways they hadn't anticipated. He said it in a flat voice, like someone who had given up being ashamed of it and was just tired. "We thought if we were on the deed, if we were co-owners, we could refinance, access the equity." "My name is the only name on this deed," I said. "Celia left it to me." "I know." She knew what she was doing. I turned to face him. She knew what had happened between us. She knew I'd spent 4 years alone, and why. She left me this place because she wanted me to have something no one could take from me. He was quiet. "I have a question," I said, "and I need an honest answer. The letters Celia sent me. Did you know about them?" Something moved across his face that wasn't surprise. It was older than surprise. "I didn't know she sent that many," he said finally. "But you knew." "Heather said." He stopped. He looked at the lake. "Heather said that contact with your family was making it harder for you to accept the boundaries we'd set. She said she was handling the mail situation. She told you she was returning my sister's letters. She told me she was managing communication." I let that sit. "I found 30 letters in Celia's desk drawer," I said. 30 that she kept. There may be more she didn't. Every one of them returned unopened in your wife's handwriting. All the years I thought Celia had pulled away from me. She was writing every month. She died thinking I never wrote back. My son put his face in his hands. He didn't say anything, and I didn't fill the silence for him. I sat and looked at the water until I heard him get up and go back inside. That night there was arguing through the wall. Not words, just shapes. The compressed and airless sound of a conversation happening in a confined space between people who have had it too many times before. At one point, my son's voice rose briefly, and I caught the word enough before it went quiet again. In the morning, I called Marta. She arrived at the cabin at 2 in the afternoon with a folder tucked under her arm and the calm manner of someone who had done this before and was not going to make it more dramatic than it needed to be. My son and his wife were in the living room when she walked in, sitting apart on the couch in a way that said everything about what the night had been. Marta introduced herself, set the folder on the coffee table, and didn't sit down. "I'm here on behalf of my client, the sole owner of this property," she said. "I want to make sure we understand each other clearly." My daughter-in-law started to say something. Marta looked at her pleasantly and said, "I'll ask that you wait until I'm finished." She laid it out methodically. My legal standing as sole property owner, the documentation of my competency she'd had prepared as a precaution, the return labels on Celia's letters as evidence of a pattern of interference. She mentioned that I had already spoken to my bank and that my accounts were flagged. She explained that my son and his wife had 48 hours to remove their belongings. My daughter-in-law's face during all of this was something I almost felt sorry for. She was searching for the angle the way she always had, recalculating, rearranging, looking for the version of the conversation where she still came out ahead. It wasn't there. I watched her understand that, and I watched her go very still. My son didn't look at his wife once. He looked at the folder. He looked at his hands. At the end, he looked at me, and I held his eyes until he dropped them. After Marta left, the 3 of us sat in the quiet for a moment. Then my daughter-in-law stood, smoothed her shirt, and walked back to the guest room without speaking. She had nothing left to perform. My son stayed where he was. "Mom," he said, his voice was rough. "I know. I let things happen that I shouldn't have let happen, for a long time." He shook his head slowly. "I told myself it was keeping the peace. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I told myself—" He stopped. "I told myself a lot of things that weren't true." "Yes," I said, "you did." I could see he was waiting for me to make it easier for him, to say it was all right, that I understood, that we'd put it behind us. I had done that for many years, and it had cost me everything it cost me. So instead, I said, "You're my son. That hasn't changed. But I need time, and I need you to figure out the real work of what comes next. When you're ready to do that honestly, I'll be here." He nodded once. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running and wasn't yet sure what standing still felt like. They were gone by the following evening. The guest room was left neater than it had been when they arrived. My reading chair was already back at the window. I saw it the moment I stepped inside, and I understood without needing to know whether it was my son or his wife who had moved it back. Some reckonings don't require witnesses. I sat at Celia's desk that night and read through every letter she had sent me. She had kept writing even after she figured out what was happening to them. There's one letter, maybe 3 years into the silence, where her handwriting gets a little larger than usual, like she wanted to be sure of something. "I don't believe you're receiving these. I'm going to keep sending them anyway. I want there to be a record that I tried." 2 years more of letters after that. Monthly, without answer, without knowing if any of it reached me. The last one was dated 4 months before her cancer diagnosis. It was short. It said, "I hope you know I love you. I hope this finds you somehow. If it doesn't, maybe you'll find it anyway when you're ready to come home." I sat with that letter until the cabin went fully dark and the loons started calling from across the water. The property deed is in my name. Marta filed the final documentation last week and called to tell me the matter is legally closed. My son left a voicemail 10 days after they drove away. Not an explanation, not a justification, just his voice sounding tired and human, saying he was sorry that he was talking to someone that he understood if I needed space. I haven't called back yet. I'm keeping the voicemail. The woman 2 houses down on the lake is named Fran. She was one of Celia's closest friends, I've learned. Someone who used to walk the South Trail with her on winter mornings and come over for coffee when the weather made staying inside feel too long. She knocked on my door last week holding a covered dish and looking apologetic about it. "I didn't want to intrude," she said. "I just wanted you to know that your sister talked about you all the time. She was so proud of you." I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table where my son had stared at his coffee, and my daughter-in-law had mentioned property values twice, and Fran told me small, specific things about Celia. The kind of things a person only knows about someone because they were actually there, paying attention. By the time it was dark outside, I realized I had laughed 3 times. It felt like a lot. It felt like a start. Celia left me this cabin so I would have somewhere no one could take away from me. I think she also left me something else, the record of 30 letters. A proof of love I hadn't known I possessed, a stubborn, patient testament written out month by month into silence and kept anyway, waiting for me to come home. Some things I'm learning you have to fight to keep. Others have been waiting for you all along, in a shoebox in a drawer, patient as the lake.